Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is a comparison between the Canon EOS R6 Mark II versus the Sony A7 IV. Now you might be saying, Jared, why is the R8 on the counter? And it's simple, because the R8 is very similar to the R6 Mark II, and we'll go through all of the specs of these two cameras, and then I'll throw in some information about this camera here because it definitely belongs here. Now the point of this video is to help anybody out there trying to decide should they go with the Sony A7 IV or the Canon R6 Mark II, and of course I threw the R8 here because we're gonna help you figure out which one might be the right one for you, give you the reasons why or the reasons why not, and then you can make your own decision. Now I've used each of these cameras in the real world, so I have a lot of experience in action shooting, in portraits, not so much in landscapes, but I've used these so I can give you the best feedback possible. So now let's jump into the specs, starting with the image sensor. The R6 Mark II has a 24.2 megapixel full frame CMOS sensor that's powered by a Digic X processor. The A7 IV has a 33 megapixel full frame BSI CMOS sensor powered by a Bionz XR processor, which is the same as the A1. I should also mention that the processor in this Canon is the same as you find in the R3. So there's definitely similarities there, but this one is 33 megapixels, so you're getting slightly more, and then this one is 24. And of course, the R8 has the same innards as the R6 Mark II. So who's getting a check mark here for sensor capability? Well, if we're saying who has more, then we could easily give Sony a check mark. I can't tell you which one is better yet until we go through all of the specs, and then we can take everything as a cumulative thing and decide which one is right for you. But they're both very good sensors. They're also all very good cameras. Now let's talk about native ISO. The Canons go 100 to 102,400 natively, expandable all the way up to 204,800. The Sony goes from 100 to 51,200 and is also expandable up to 204,800. Now with more megapixels comes more responsibility. What I mean by that is with 33 or the higher megapixels that you have, the higher ISO capability gets lessened ever so slightly. So you might get a cleaner image out of the Canons at higher ISOs than you will with the Sony. You can push both of these pretty far, but you are going to get cleaner results over here with these Canons. So I'm going to give the Canons a check mark this time around. Now let's talk about shooting speeds. We've got the R6 Mark II will do 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, but it also gives you 40 frames per second with the electronic shutter. You can do that at 40 frames a second, 20 frames per second, or 5 frames per second in 12-bit RAW. It offers a pre-shooting RAW burst mode, has high-frequency flicker mode, HDR moving subject mode as well. Now, the Sony will give you 10 frames per second with both the electronic and mechanical shutter in 12-bit compressed RAW. But when you shoot uncompressed RAW or lossless compressed RAW, you're only getting roughly 6 frames per second. That 10 frames per second thing is misleading in the Sonys. We've seen it time and time again, and it continues on. Now, I should mention that the R8 right here is going to give you 6 frames per second with a first curtain shutter. It doesn't have a full mechanical shutter, but you're still getting the 40 frames per second, the 20 frames per second electronic, and the 5 frames per second electronic if you go into those modes. This is a big differentiator between these two cameras. If you are shooting action sports, I get 40 frames per second with this. But some of you might be saying, what about rolling shutter? What about the readout speed of the sensors? Well, these do not have stacked sensors. The Sony A1 has a stacked sensor, the A9 has a stacked sensor, the Nikon Z9 has a stacked sensor, and the Canon R3, that has a stacked sensor as well. You get faster readout speeds, which means you get less jelloing or you get less issues with a bat when someone's swinging it. And I will tell you that the R6 Mark II is by far more superior than what you're getting with the A7 IV when it comes to jelloing and rolling. When I used this the first time to shoot hockey and I was panning with the subjects, you can see the background boards are on an angle. That is horrible when it comes to shooting with an electronic shutter. And the fact that this only gives you 10 frames per second regular with the mechanical and only 10 frames per second with the electronic, whereas this is giving you 12 with mechanical and 40 with the electronic says all it needs to say. I mean, obviously I like this much more, and you get less rolling shutter. The readout speeds of the R8 and the R6 Mark II are far superior to this. The R8 is fantastic. And when I was shooting lacrosse outdoors, you could see that the lines are straight in the background when I am panning. So readout speed all day on these Canons, all the check marks in the world are going to the Canons over the A7 IV in this important metric. Look, if you're not doing action sports, you're doing portraits, you're doing landscapes, this is gonna be great. It's gonna get the job done. But man, in this day and age where if you have the ability to shoot at 40 frames per second and this one doesn't, you can't get angry at the Canon and be like, Jared, why are you liking this so much? Because it gives me a lot more power. To go into one more thing with the R6 Mark II versus something like the Stack Sensor R3, let me give you an example. This is a tennis player with the R6 Mark II. You can see that the racket is starting to bow ever so slightly, or in some situations, the ball is getting a little warped. Now that may not be in every situation, but in fast action sports, you might see an issue. Whereas with the R3, you don't have that same issue with the ball or with the swing. Now that's an extreme example. Whereas with the R8, when I was photographing the Harlem Globetrotters going up for dunks and running around the court and sliding towards me, I did not see issues with the rolling shutter. You just don't see it. Maybe ever so slightly in one ball bouncing did I see it across 1,600 of the photos that I took where it was a little squashed, but most people would never even notice that. The readout speeds are so fast that you might think that it's a stack sensor, even though it's not. Let me jump in here real quick because I want to show you this photo taken with the Canon R8 and edited with 11 of the presets from FroPack 3, starting with Zoolander, followed by Winnebago. Then we've got Walter White, Prestige Worldwide, Mount Airy, Mentos, King Contrast, Eckert, Capone, Canadian Tuxedo, and Fifth Element. But check out my favorite preset of all time called Skittles. Boom, one click, and that's how good Skittles looks. So look, if you're looking to speed up your raw workflow, give yourself a great starting point, or you're tired of presets just not working, ours work. We created 15 custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/FroPack3. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters. And if you decide to pick them up right now, they are currently on sale. Or you could save even more by getting the triple play bundle that includes FroPack 1, 2, and 3, as well as Skittles. Now, let's get back to the video. Now let's get into the lens mounts. Canon has the RF lens mount and Sony has the E mount. Is there a pro and con to both of these? The answer is a little bit. Canon's lenses are a little more expensive right now for the RF mount. They do not offer third-party support, and that's the biggest thing right now, is that they don't allow Sigma and Tamron at the time of recording this, because that may change by the time you watch this video, to have third-party options. Now, Sony has a ton of third-party options as well as native glass. They make very nice glass. Their G-Master lenses are fantastic. And the fact that you can get great Tamron lenses on this and you can get great Sigma Art lenses on this as well as less expensive Tamron and Sigma lenses gives these guys a check mark in terms of options. Now in terms of quality, I'm loving what I get out of my RF glass. I love all of the options that there are. One of the issues you might run into is if you want to get better glass on the Canon front, you might be spending a little more money up front. Or you can adapt older EF lenses, which were the DSLR lenses from Canon, on this camera with an EF to RF adapter. It works seamlessly. So you can pick up older lenses from Canon that were pro lenses and adapt them. Do you want to live the adapter life? The answer is not really. The quicker you can get away from doing that and go to all native lenses, that's a win. In terms of the mount, I love the glass. You're just going to spend a little bit of money to get that better glass on the Canon front. So for now, we're going to go with check marks on the Sony front because you have all of those extra options natively. Now let's get into autofocus. The R6 Mark II incorporates the autofocusing system from the R3 with an improved deep learning engine for better subject tracking with improved stickiness. You've got dual pixel AF2, which is freaking fantastic. You've got IAF, which is amazing. You've got modes for human, animal, vehicle, horses, airplanes, trains. It's going to track all of those different options. Honestly, I never switch over to those. I guess if you're shooting a train, it shouldn't be that hard to hit a train. It's a train. right? It's not that hard. Now, birds and animals, that's great. So you have fantastic AF on this camera. On the Sony front, we've got IAF, we've got lock-on tracking, we've got human and animal AF, and you also have touchpad focusing. There's not a lot in here, and it's not like they said that it has the A1's autofocus, or it takes from the A9. It doesn't. When I was using this camera, what I felt was that it was lagging behind in autofocus. I felt like I'm sitting there tracking my subjects and the box isn't locking on and being as sticky as I expected it to be, especially when it's newer. It felt like it was laggier. It felt like it was slower shooting because it was. Now, I loved the Sony a7 III, and of course the a7C was slightly updated, and I felt that that focusing system was sticky and accurate and felt great. It's not to say that this one isn't accurate, it just felt like it was slower and lagging behind and not a worthy upgrade from where the a7 III was, which was one of the greatest mirrorless cameras ever made. That thing was fantastic. This is fine. I'm just not as happy with the autofocus in it. The R8 is going to run circles around the autofocus in the a7 IV. It just is, which means that the R6 Mark II, being that it's the same autofocusing system as this bad boy right here, is going to do the same exact thing. So the autofocus in the Canons at this point, but across these three cameras, is far superior to what you're getting out of this camera. Now, Sony has gone ahead and come out with the a7 R5. That has a new focusing system. It would have been great if they had that focusing system in this bad boy, but when you're getting an R3 style focusing system in cameras that are far less expensive than $6,000+, it's a major win for Canon right here. Now let's talk about memory card slots. You have two SD card slots in the R6 II. In terms of the Sony, you have two SD card slots that are reverse compatible with CF Express Type A cards. Those are much faster cards, but they are also a lot more expensive than the SD cards. So take that into consideration when you're making your purchase. But the good news is that you can put SD cards in this camera as well. Keep in mind, when you're buying memory cards, buy the best memory cards that you can. Use companies like ProGrade Digital, you've got SanDisk, you've got Lexar, Sony makes their own cards, so just make sure you get the best cards possible, because the last line of defense between having your images blow up on you or not is using good cards. Do not buy cheap, China-made, no-name brand cards off of Amazon because you want to save money. You spend all this money on cameras and trips to go take pictures. Do not cheap out on memory cards. Now, here's one of the differentiators between the R6 Mark II and the R8 is that this just has one SD card slot. So that means there is no dual recording. There's no redundancy. You have to keep that in mind. But the differences in price between these is $1,000. So you're getting a little bit more for that extra money. And at the end of this video, I'm going to help you decide, should you save $1,000 and go with an R8 over going with something like an a7 IV, but we'll get to that. In terms of cards, I like the CF Express A cards. They're small, they're quick. The only problem is they're super expensive. They are fast though. And speaking of fast, you have a buffer of 828 RAW files when using the CF Express Type A cards in this camera. Now keep in mind, it also doesn't shoot very fast at 10 frames per second, so you're probably not going to outrun the buffer as quick. And yes, it's 33 megapixels, so it's a little bit more, but it's slower shooting than if you were doing 40 frames per second. When it comes to the R6 Mark II, you're getting 110 RAW files. So if you're shooting at 40 frames per second, you can do the math. That's how long you can hold that shutter down before you outrun it. You're generally not going to outrun this camera. You shouldn't really be banging out 3, 4, 5 seconds in a row of shooting. With all that being said, you're going to get anywhere from 38 up to 56 RAW files recording with the R8. Much smaller buffer, much slower when it comes to writing to that SD card. So if you're going to shoot at 40 frames per second, you might outrun that buffer in roughly 1 second if you just smash that button. Now, when I shot sports, I was doing like a half a second burst, take my finger off, action, half a second burst and going, and it wasn't much of a problem. If you do outrun the buffer and you fill it up completely, you're anywhere from 5 to 6 seconds until you can start shooting again. So who gets a check mark? Well, Sony actually gets the check mark because that dual type of slot thing is amazing, that you can put SDs in there and the CF Express Type A's, so you're getting 2 check marks. All right, now let's talk about max shutter speeds. In the Canon, you're getting 1/8,000th of a second for the mechanical shutter and 1/16,000th of a second when you go with the electronic shutter. What that means is if you're using a fast 1.2 lens or a f2 or even a 2.8 on a super bright day, you're at 100 ISO and you're at 1/8,000th of a second and it's still too bright out, well, you can flip into electronic shutter mode and get up to 1/16,000th of a second. That's a big deal. The Sony will give you up to 1/8,000th of a second with mechanical and electronic, but it doesn't go beyond that. On the R8 side, because there's a slight difference here to the R6 Mark II, you get 1/4000th of a second, but you also get that 1/16,000th of a second when it comes to electronic. The 1/4000th is with that first curtain shutter. Now, I should say that the R8, in my hands when I've been using it, is really an electronic shutter camera first. 40 frames a second, 20 frames per second, 5 frames, whatever you want. Just shooting at that 6 frames per second is really slow, and like I said, with the fast readout speeds, it hasn't been an issue at all. Let me cut in here real quick and say, would you like me to send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations? If so, just look for this orange box over on FroKnowsPhoto.com, put your name, email address in it, hit send it. I'm going to send you that guide for free. Now that was a lot of information about stills shooting with these cameras. Now let's move in to some of the video specs. The R6 Mark II is going to give you full frame 4K UHD video recording at up to 60 frames per second at 10-bit 422 in H.265, which is oversampled from 6K. If you want a little bit more reach, you could do crop Super 35 4K up to 60p with binning. There's full width 10-bit 6K ProRes RAW or Super 35 12-bit 3.7K Pro RAW video output up to 60p. Now full frame, you can get up to 180 frames per second at 1080p. There's no record limit. You get C-Log 3. There's a smaller micro HDMI port. You've got a 5-second movie pre-recording, digital hot shoe for wireless audio. There's false color as well as focus breathing correction. That's quite a bit of stuff to say. With the R8, the only thing different here is that you don't have the ability to record RAW externally or internally for that matter. Moving on to the A7 IV, you have full frame 4K UHD video recording at 30 frames per second at 10-bit 422 in H.265, which is oversampled from 7K. There's a cropped Super 35 4K mode at up to 60 frames per second, full frame shooting at 120 frames per second at 1080p, unlimited record time, S-Log 3 and S-Cinetone, full HDMI port, focus breathing compensation, as well as a digital hot shoe. So as you can tell, the video features are very similar in these cameras. Now you get the 7K oversampled, you get the 6K oversampled here, you get the 180 frames per second versus the 120. They're very similar. If you don't need raw output, which we've never used the raw output ourselves, it doesn't really matter. I do like the larger HDMI plug. For most people out there, they're rarely ever plugging HDMI into these things anyway. And when you take everything into consideration, the autofocus, the feels of the cameras, the processing, they are very similar. So this one is very hard to say which one is better. It's going to come down to personal preference. Look, if you're going to be on the Canon front and that's the camera that you have, then that's all that really matters. If you're going to be on the Sony front and that's all you have, that's all that really matters. They're very similar. So it's going to be a matter of deciding still features or video features, or a mix of both, which is going to be better for you. And you already know what I think about the still features of the Canons. That's a win for me. So for me going into something, I'm going to lean here. But for a lot of the Sony shooters, this is a solid body and you're going to get great video features. Since we're talking about video features, let's talk about IBIS or in-body image stabilization. The R6 Mark II gives you 5-axis in-body stabilization at up to 8 stops of IS with certain lenses, because when you pair the new IS lenses with the image stabilization of this camera, you will get up to 8 or up to 7 with certain other IS lenses. With the Sony, you have 5-axis steady shot up to 5.5 stops of stabilization. You've got optical active mode stabilization, but that is going to crop in slightly into your frame. In Steven's experience, and he's the one who shoots the video more often with us, he does not like the image stabilization in the Sony, especially compared to this one of the Canon. The image stabilization in this is much better. The image stabilization in the R8 is non-existent because it does not have image stabilization. This is one of the differentiators between the R6 R6 Mark II and the R8, of which there are not a lot of things that differentiate them. But in this case, we both love the IBIS that you get out of the Canon. Now let's talk about the bodies. Both bodies feel fantastic in the hands. The R6 Mark II is designed really well. A lot of custom function buttons that you can map out any way that you want, any way you see fit. You can change things. Those things work great. You have a joystick in a great place. It just works out really well. On-off switch, modes off to the left. Look, they're different systems, so you're gonna get different feels. The Sony feels fine. The old Sonys felt really bad in the hands. The newer Sonys feel much better. Same for mapping out buttons. You can do all of the same things that you do with the Canon, basically with the Sony right here. Joystick in a great place. All the buttons are there. Lots of great options. Both of the bodies feel nice. Now, the R8 is a much smaller body. It's much lighter. It's much smaller. It feels really good in the hands, but you cannot get a grip for this. Whereas you can get a grip for both of these cameras that give you extra battery life because you put 2 batteries in there, and also gives you the ability to shoot vertical. So no one's getting a check mark on bodies here because that comes down to personal preference. Let me jump in here real quick and say that this video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you're looking to build your very own online portfolio, use what I've used for my personal website at jaredpolin.com for more than 10 years because it's simple, easy, affordable, and I don't need to know coding, and I guarantee you, you can have a gallery up in a matter of minutes and out into the world. So if you'd like to get a 14-day free trial, head on over to squarespace.com/FroKnowsPhoto. If you decide that it's for you, use the code FroKnowsPhoto at checkout to get 10% off your first order. Now, let's get back to the video. Moving on to the viewfinders, the Canon R6 Mark II, 3.69 million dot EVF with 120 frames per second refresh rate. The Sony has a 3.68 million dot EVF with 120 frames per second refresh rate. And the R8, being that it's different than the R6 Mark II here, has a 2.36 million dot EVF with 120 frames refresh rate. They're all going to be fine. You're not going to see much of a difference between both or all three of these, but what I will tell you is that from my experience using all the EVFs from Fuji to Nikon to Canon to Sony, is that I like the way that Canon does their transitioning from light to dark. Whereas with the Sony, now bear with me, this is going to make sense in a second, when you go in a light situation or a dark situation, there's no gradual change of the brightness of the EVF when you set it to auto. It either goes super bright or much darker, which makes it harder to see, whereas with the Canon, it seems to be a better representation of the scene that I'm in, which might help you get better exposures in the long run. Moving on to the LCD touchscreens on the back of these cameras, you've got a 3-inch 1.62 million dot vari-angle touchscreen on the Canons, and you have a 3-inch 1.03 million dot vari-angle touchscreen on the Sony. The Sony touchscreens and quality on those have been terrible in terms of how they look, not how they're built. They're fine. Flip out rotatable screens are great. It's just that the quality is lesser on this screen. It's less. It's almost 1 million dots on this one. Not fantastic, not great. And that's an issue for some people who like to use the LCD screen to shoot. I want to slap you if you're someone who's using the LCD screen to shoot normal stuff. Look, if you're holding it above your head or holding it down low or at a weird angle, that's where that screen comes into play. But if you're taking portraits or someone's right in front of you or you're shooting sports, put your eye up to the damn viewfinder. That's how you do it. It's not me being, oh, you're so old school. No, it's more stable when you do it. You also look like a moron when you hold the camera out in front of you and take pictures. We're almost there, guys. We're almost at the end. Let's talk about batteries. You have a LP E6NH battery with USB charging here in the Canon. The Sony offers you the NP-FT Z100, which is a really good battery on the mirrorless world. It lasts a pretty long time. It's the same battery that you find in just about all of the Sony mirrorless cameras. Now the R8 here uses a smaller battery. It's the LP-E17. It does have USB-C charging, but it's a smaller battery. That's one of the differentiators between these two cameras is a smaller battery. Smaller battery means less power, means less shots, less shooting of video. So keep that in mind when you're making your decision. These batteries are fine in both of these cameras. Nothing is going to be, you can't separate them and be like, this is better than that one. They all work really well. recommendations, always have extra batteries, and in this day and age with USB-C charging, get one of those charger banks that not only charges your phone, but with USB-C charging, you can get more juice into your cameras. Now, in terms of weight, the R8 weighs in at 1 pound or 461 grams. The R6 Mark II is 1.3 pounds, 588 grams, and the Canon, or the Sony here, is a little bit of a chunker at 1.6 pounds or 737 grams. And I'm kidding, it's not really a chunker. It's not very heavy. That's just to tell you the difference in the weight. If that's a big deal to you, then obviously the R8 is the lightest camera here, but across the board, these cameras feel great in the hands. Both of these companies have done a fantastic job there. Now, pricing, because there's a big difference here. I mean, on this side, the R6 Mark II comes in at $2,499, with the A7 IV coming in at $2,499, and then $1,000 less is $1,499 for the R8. Now, I know that the main focus of this video is to help you decide which direction should you go. If you're looking at an A7 IV or the R6 Mark II, which way should you go? My opinion, based off of everything that we've talked about, from shooting stills to shooting video, my opinion here is that the R6 Mark II runs circles around the A7 IV. It's not to say that the A7 IV isn't a very good camera. When it comes to stills, the Canon smashes it and buries it into the ground because of the 40 frames per second, the 12 frames per second mechanical, the R3 autofocus, the R3 processor, the fact that it has such a fast readout speed for a non-stack sensor camera. That is a win in my book. The video features are going to be very similar, but if I was starting out today taking everything into consideration, even the difference in lens mounts, I'm going to go into the Canon ecosystem between these two things. And I would even go as far as saying that if you want to save $1,000, the R8 is going to run circles around this camera. Now, take out the fact that you don't have the 2 card slots or the bigger battery or IBIS. Those are things that you can live with. They may not be my first choice to not have 2 card slots, but if I had to choose the camera to take into the world and I had to pick between these two and a system, I'm going with the R8 right now. I just am, because of the focus, because of the 40 frames a second. The same thing that I said here is in a $1,000 less camera. Again, you do have the third-party lens options here, but you also have the older lens options that are still really good lenses that you can adapt to this system. Look, there's a lot here, and this might upset some people that I went this direction, but if you used all the cameras that I get to use, you would know the subtle differences and the major differences between all of them, and I'm gonna tell you which is better based off of my real-world experience. And that means going back a couple years where Canon was getting their lunch eaten by Sony. I will tell you it as it happens. So let me know which one you would go with down below. Give me your reasons, and I thank you guys very much for watching. Jared, Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.